Welcome to the third deep dive into Judith Butler's seminal work, Gender Trouble, a really radical rethinking of feminism, identity, and, well, the very meaning of gender.
That's right. And today, we're turning our attention, really focusing in on the ideas in the section called subversive bodily acts. That's roughly pages 101 to 180 in most editions.
Yeah, it's a dense section. We've got the text right here focusing on these later parts, but also pulling from earlier bits for context.
And our mission, I suppose, is to try and unpack what Butler actually means by subversive bodily acts.
And why thinking about the body this way is this site of cultural inscription, but also maybe disruption, is so critical for gender politics today.
Definitely. And to really get into that, the whole idea of the body as a site, we probably need to just quickly touch back on some of those earlier points Butler makes.
Right, like the challenge to the idea of women as this sort of fixed, stable group that feminism just represents.
Exactly. That foundational idea that the subject of feminism isn't just sort of there, but is actively produced.
Yeah, that really shakes things up from the start.
And it leads straight into questioning, the common sense idea of sex, biological sex, is this purely natural thing, totally separate from cultural gender.
So it's not the simple story of first comes biology, then culture adds gender on top.
Butler flips that. The argument is that gender is more like the apparatus of production, the machinery almost, whereby the sexes themselves are established.
Wow, okay, so gender produces sex, or at least the effect of a natural pre-existing sex.
Yeah, it creates the effect of a sexed nature. What we perceive as biological fact existing before culture is argued to be, in fact, an effect of these cultural and performative processes.
Okay, I think I'm with you. Sex itself gets produced, in a way, by how we do gender. And this must tie into that whole critique of the metaphysics of substance, the idea that there's no fixed being behind the doing.
Exactly. It's counterintuitive, isn't it? The argument isn't that we have an inner gender identity that we then express outwards. No. The text says, quite clearly, no gender identity behind the expressions of gender. That identity is performatively constituted by the very expressions that are said to be its results.
So the performance isn't just showing something that's already inside. The performance, the repetition of acts, is what creates the identity.
It constitutes it.
And that puts the body front and center, doesn't it? That's where the performance, the doing, actually happens.
It really does. And to understand how this constant doing starts to feel like a solid natural being, Butler looks at some, pretty complex psychoanalytic ideas, particularly Freud on melancholia and identification.
Melancholia, like deep sadness or loss.
Sort of, but in a specific Freudian sense. Freud talked about how when we lose someone we love, the ego can sometimes hang on to them by incorporating them, taking on their traits.
Ah, okay, like absorbing parts of them into yourself.
Yeah, he put it quite poetically. By taking flight into the ego, love escapes annihilation. So this identification helps shape the ego, your character.
Part of who you are is built from these echoes of lost loves.
That's the Freudian model. And Butler applies this to gender. For example, repudiating the mother as a love object might lead a boy to identify with her, consolidating femininity, or shift desire to the father, consolidating masculinity, and vice versa for girls.
And Freud himself seemed a bit hazy on what masculinity or femininity actually was, right?
Yeah.
Didn't he add that note, whatever that made consistent?
He did, and that little hesitation is telling, isn't it? It shows how much these categories are already culturally loaded, even when trying to trace psychological origins.
Okay, but what's the twist Butler brings in?
Well, drawing on others like Abraham and Torok, the idea is that this incorporation isn't literal, it's a fantasy of taking something inside.
A psychological fantasy, not a physical one.
Right. And here's the crucial move Butler makes. Maybe this imagined interior space of incorporation actually gets projected onto the body's surface. The body itself becomes this sort of incorporated space.
Whoa. So the body surface isn't just passive. It's where this whole drama of loss, identification, and fantasy plays out and gets mistaken for biological reality.
That's the idea. And it becomes clearer when the text discusses the different ways loss might be handled, comparing, say, the loss of a heterosexual love object versus a homosexual one.
How are they different in this view?
Well, losing a heterosexual object is often framed as grief. The object is gone, but the possibility of heterosexual desire remains, maybe finding a new object.
Okay, standard grieving.
But the loss of a same-sex love object within a homophobic context that forces its repudiation is argued to be sustained through melancholia. This requires denying the loss, entirely denying the object and the desire.
Like, I never lost them, I never loved them, I never even felt that way. Total denial.
Exactly, a profound denial. And this melancholic refusal, the argument goes, gets literalized on the body's surface. It's performed on the body in a way that conceals its own history, making the resulting gender or sexual identity seem like a natural fact.
Making the constructed look innate. That's powerful. And thinking about the body's surface, that takes us right into the politics of boundaries, doesn't it?
It does. And here the text brings in anthropologist Mary Douglas. She wrote about how cultures establish body boundaries through taboos, essentially imposing order on what she called inherently untidy experience.
Our bodies aren't naturally neat packages. Culture draws the lines.
Right. And Douglas saw the physical body as a kind of symbol, a synecdoche for the social system itself. Its boundaries mirror society's boundaries. And the body's margins, orifices, skin becomes sites of perceived danger and vulnerability.
And this connects directly to how certain groups get labeled as polluting. The text mentions Simon Watney on AIDS.
Yes, Watney analyzed how, during the AIDS crisis, the figure of the polluting person became strongly associated with gay men. It wasn't just about transmission, it tapped into deeper cultural anxieties about boundary trespass.
Meaning sex acts seen as violating bodily norms.
Exactly. Things like anal or oral sex were framed in homophobic discourse as polluting boundary violations, linking homosexuality itself to contamination. And this anxiety often extended even to lesbians, regardless of actual risk profiles. It shows a fear of permeable bodies reflecting a fear of permeable social categories.
This idea of defining the self by casting something out, making it unclean or other, that sounds a lot like Julia Kristeva's concept of objection.
It absolutely resonates.
Okay.
Kristeva talks about objection as this process where we establish our sense of self by forcefully ejecting something that might have even been part of us and defining it as disgusting, as defiling otherness.
So to be me, I have to constantly push away and pathologize what is not me.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And Iris Young, using Kristeva, showed how this repulsion helps solidify dominant identities like normative sex, race, sexuality, by creating the other through exclusion. The boundary between inner and outer, self and other, is precarious.
And things like, well, bodily functions, excremental passages, as the text puts it, where the inside becomes outside, constantly challenge those neat lines.
They do. They literally demonstrate the permeability we try to deny. And this process can be metaphorically mapped onto social hierarchies, turning marginalized groups into, well, the shit that the dominant identity needs to expel to maintain its own perceived purity. The desire for perfectly sealed bodies reflects a fear of this messy reality.
Okay, shifting gears slightly, but staying with constructed categories. Foucault comes in quite strongly here.
Right. Foucault's argument, famously, is that sex and sexuality aren't natural givens that power then represses. Instead, they are effects of power knowledge systems. Power produces the very categories it seems to regulate.
Which challenges those liberation models that assume a free, natural sexuality waiting to be unleashed.
Exactly. And the case of Herculin Barbin is presented as a key example.
The intersex person whose journals Foucault published.
Yes. Herculin's experience, her anatomical ambiguity, just didn't fit the binary boxes of sex, gender, or desire. Foucault reads Herculin as representing the sexual impossibility of an identity, someone living at the point where the rules governing sex-gender desire break down or converge chaotically.
A living contradiction to the system.
In a way.
Yeah.
And Foucault's description of Herculin's pleasures, like grins hanging about without the cat, points back to that critique of substance. Maybe feelings and pleasures don't need a fixed underlying identity to anchor them.
But the text hints at a potential tension in Foucault's reading.
It does. On one hand, Foucault seems interested in how non-normative experiences, perhaps especially in homosexual contexts, might challenge the very category of sex. But he also presents Herculine's story as quite tragic, shaped by the suffering caused by those rigid categories. So is the goal to dismantle the categories or understand the lived experience within them? It's a complex point.
And this relates to Foucault's shattering laughter.
That laughter, his reaction to things like Borges's bizarre classification system, or perhaps to questions about fixed gay-lesbian identities, is seen as significant. It's the laughter that erupts when our fundamental categories, our ways of ordering the world, are shown to be arbitrary, maybe even absurd. It disrupts that basic binary of same and other.
And it's not just philosophy or social theory. Even hard science gets tangled in these cultural assumptions about binaries.
That's a really crucial point made using the example of the search for a so-called master gene for sex determination, like the TDF gene.
Right, the research looking at X individuals assigned male or XY individuals assigned female, trying to find a single genetic switch.
Yes, hypothesizing a translocated gene. But the critique, highlighted through scientists like Aisher and Washburn and cited via Anne Fausto Sterling, is that this whole research program was biased from the start.
Biased how?
By framing the quest as finding the male determining factor. It essentially defined femaleness passively as just the absence of the male signal, ignoring the complex, active biological processes involved in developing ovaries.
So it's smuggled in a cultural assumption. Male, active determinant, female affords passive default.
Precisely. The cultural baggage about gender-active masculinity, passive femininity shaped the scientific questions being asked about biological sex. It shows how difficult it is to separate the two, how biology itself gets interpreted through and can even reproduce that cultural lens.
Okay, so if sex and gender are so deeply intertwined, culturally shaped, and if gender is this performative doing,
Yeah.
it brings us right back to performance and maybe acts like drag.
Yes, exactly. The text uses practices like drag, cross-dressing, and also butch femme identities as examples of how gender performance works and how it can be, well, troubled.
Now, drag often gets criticized, right, for being stereotypical or mocking.
It does face those critiques, but Butler offers a counter-reading, drawing from the source material. The argument is that drag doesn't just copy gender, it plays with the gap between, say, assigned sex, felt identity, and the visible performance of gender.
It highlights the fact that those things can be separated.
Exactly. It reveals their distinctness. They're often assumed to line up neatly, especially within what the text calls the regulatory fiction of heterosexual coherence, the assumption that sex, gender, and desire naturally align in a specific way.
So drag, by imitating gender, actually shows us that gender itself is a kind of imitation.
That's the core argument. It implicitly reveals the imitative structure of gender itself as well as its contingency. It suggests there's no original authentic gender being imitated. Gender is always already a performance, a citation, or repetition. Drag just makes that explicit, often in a dissonant and denaturalized way.
It exposes the fabricated unity and shows how sex and gender are denaturalized, contingent constructions.
Which then leads to the big question. If everything is constructed through these repeated performances and rules, where does agency come from? How is subversion possible?
Yeah, if we're just products of discourse and repetition, how can we ever change anything?
Well, the argument presented is that agency isn't about finding some magical space outside of power or discourse. It's not about being a subject before the rules.
So where is it?
Agency lies within the process of repetition itself, specifically in the possibility of a variation on that repetition.
Okay, so it's not escaping the rules, but messing with how they're repeated,
Yeah.
playing with the performance.
Exactly. Think about the injunction to be a given gender. It's not one simple rule. It's often a messy bundle of contradictory demands, be a good mother, and a desirable object, and a competent worker,
And trying to meet all those demands perfectly is impossible. It creates tension.
Right. And those failures to perform perfectly, the incoherent configurations that result because the demands clash, these aren't just mistakes. The source suggests these failures actually produce the possibility of a complex reconfiguration and redeployment.
That's where the subversive potential lies, in the glitches and inconsistencies.
That's where subversive repetition can happen. It's about participating in the necessary performances of gender, because we have to, but doing it with a difference, introducing variations, exaggerations, inconsistencies that highlight the constructedness and contest the rigidity of the norms.
So being constructed isn't the opposite of having agency.
No, quite the opposite according to this view. Construction is the necessary scene of agency. It provides the very terms, the language, the practices through which agency can even be articulated and understood. You intervene in the repetitive practices that construct reality.
So bringing this all together, what does this deep dive into subversive bodily acts really tell us? What should you take away?
I think the crucial takeaway is that the body isn't some neutral background. It's profoundly shaped by culture, a key site where norms get inscribed, where boundaries are policed through ideas of purity and pollution, and where identity itself gets built through these repeated expected performances.
But, and this is the hopeful part maybe, because gender is a performance, an enactment, not a fixed essence. It's always open to change, to variation, to disruption.
Exactly. The very pressure to perform gender perfectly creates inevitable failures, gaps, moments of incoherence. And those moments aren't just problems, they're opportunities. They open up possibilities for different ways of being gendered, for new kinds of agency. It's about finding that wiggle room, that space for variation inside the repetition of norms.
Which leaves us with a really interesting thought, doesn't it? Something for you to consider. If gender is made real through repetitive acts, and if trying to perform it perfectly always leads to some kind of failure or incoherence,
Then maybe true subversion isn't about getting outside gender norms altogether, which might be impossible anyway. Maybe it's about strategically inhabiting those norms, repeating them, but repeating them differently. What actually happens when we consciously lean into the necessary messiness, the inherent incoherence of performing gender?